We are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor. I'm the president and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you all here into the center today. Also, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, please join our membership. We have some brochures, I believe, at the back with our volunteers. And if you're looking to volunteer for anything, also please let us know. And before we jump into what's going on today, I just want to tell you about some of the things we have coming up here in the beginning of June. On June 6th, next week, on Tuesday, we have our Awards of Excellence. And if you've not bought tickets, I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and buy some tickets. It'll be a lot of fun. It's down at the Foundry. And we get to give awards to different historical or different groups that work in history for some of the excellent work that's going on throughout the region. So it's not just based in Knoxville, it goes all the way down to Chattanooga and all the way up to the Tri-Cities. Also, later a few days after that, on June 10th, quite difficultly close actually to the 6th, we have started and reinstituted the downtown home tour. So if you're interested in architecture, if you're interested in how people live downtown, there are several homes that will be open in downtown, and we're leading a walking tour all day on June 10th through that. And we are looking for volunteers for that. So if, again, you're interested in volunteering, please let us know. So our speaker today, and I'm very excited about the talk we're about to hear because it was a very successful podcast, I believe. Dr. Locklin Sofer has been teaching history at Maryville College since 2000. And her usual interest is actually more aligned to my own, which is 18th century Europe, and in particular France. And so I guess you'd specialize in what Eric Hobsbawm called the Age of Empires. But since the pandemic breakdown, she started focusing on more local history and looked at the history of murder. And it brought her to this story, which she has done a tremendous amount of research, and I think you're working on a book about it now. And so I'm very, very interested in hearing this, and so I'd just like to turn over to our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Sorry.
And I'm very happy to be here. I have in the past brought students to study here. I've done research here, so I'm familiar with the organization and the place. So let me get started in why is a French historian studying a Knoxville serial killer? Well, I had 2 books come out in my career so far. I'm mainly a teaching professor, right? Not so much of a publisher, but my first book was about women's work in 18th century and women's inheritance rights in 18th century France. And my second book was about a murder case in France in 1720, where I had the entire dossier. So I had to learn all this background research about the history of violence and the history of murder. I hadn't realized what a huge field that is. And so I was doing so much work on murder, just in general, that my students were interested in a history of murder class. And Maryville College is a small enough place that I can just whip together a class if there's enough interest. And so I started to teach the history of murder, and I knew I was trying to look for something local, because a lot of my students are local. So I was looking online for references to cases in the area, and I found a reference to a murder in 1926 in Maryville. And it was only the first snippet of the story that was visible on the webpage. And it was only enough to say that the police insisted that this adult woman, divorced, was at her mother's house when somebody broke in and attacked them. And the police immediately said, well, it must be your ex. And she's like, no, it wasn't. It really wasn't. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Law enforcement, they're going to go with what they usually encounter, the usual scenario. And so they were insisting, no, it had to be your ex. And it turned out not to be her ex. But I needed the rest of the story. And here is where a lack of advancement in technology helped me out a lot. Because the only way to look at the Maryville Times from 1926 is to go to the public library and get on the microfilm reader and reel through it, issue by issue. And what I found when I started looking at the newspaper is it's happened again. It's happening again. I can't believe it's happening here. So I had to back it up. I had to figure out what was going on. And so I've been working on this for 2.5 years now. And I have most of a book written. And I've even switched from French history conferences to crime writers conferences, and that's been a lot of fun. I also do want to just quickly say that I will be making reference to violence and sexual assault as I go through some of these crimes. Okay, the most famous murder in the series, it's usually considered part of the series, is the murder of Bertie Lindsay, August 30th, 1919. You may have heard of this case because it was a precursor to the race riots of 1919, when the white mob heard that a black man had been arrested, suspected of killing and attempting to assault a white woman. They picked up Maurice Mays. They said, he's got to be our guy. And then they had to take him to Chattanooga right away because they knew what happens in this case if the mob gets their hands on the suspect. And so they whisked him to Chattanooga. And in the meantime, so this is Maurice Mays. He was a successful businessman. He was briefly a deputy sheriff, and he was a politician. One of the reasons we suspect that the patrolman White, who identified him, had an ongoing conflict with Mr. Mays, basically because white and black women liked him. And that was a point of contention for the patrolman, and so the night he found out that a woman had been attacked, he said, I know who did it, and went straight to his house, and they arrested him. Very little evidence. There is a widespread belief that Maurice Mays was actually the biological child of Mayor John McMillan, but raised by the Mays family. But he was a politician who worked on behalf of John McMillan, and he often campaigned for him. So the riot, so-called race riot, happened while Mays was being held in Chattanooga, but the white mob didn't accept that. They didn't believe that. They demanded the right to tour the jail, look for him. There's a lot published on the race riot of 1919, so I'm not going to spend too long in it so I can get to the rest of the series. But it did get really out of hand. It was very destructive. The National Guard was there by 9 p.m. They say up to 5,000 people were in Market Square in and around the jail, raiding, looting stores, looking for any kind of weapon or tools they could use to break into that jailhouse. The one somewhat comical event of that evening was that some of the rioters got distracted by confiscated whiskey in the jailhouse and decided not to riot anymore. The trials that took place over the course of the next couple of years, there were a couple of different lawyers. There was a whole team of defense lawyers to try to defend Maurice Mays. They had tried to get a change of venue because they didn't think, especially after the destruction and death of the mob, that they could get a fair trial here. So the jury in the first trial did convict Mays after only about 20 minutes. And the key piece of evidence against Mays was that when he had been arrested, he was taken directly to where, so Bertie Mays had been sleeping, sharing a room with her cousin, Ora Smith, another white woman. And they say that someone came into the room, tried to get in bed with them, made indecent demands, and Bertie got so scared that she jumped up and tried to flee, and that's when he shot her. Now, the survivor, Ora Smith, some sources say she was in such shock she practically couldn't stand. But nevertheless, Patrolman White took Mays under a street lamp at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Is this a guy?" And she said yes, and that was it. She never wavered from her story, so the jury convicted him. And then there was a kind of they had grounds for an appeal because as soon as the jury came back with a conviction, the judge said, well, that's a death sentence. But Tennessee law had recently changed. He was supposed to have a sentencing hearing. And so they got grounds for an appeal. They appealed it. There are actually a number of delays and appeals. But eventually, Maurice Mays was executed in March of 1922, swearing his innocence to the last day. It was the defense team for Maurice Mays that started keeping a list because they said, here's the exact pattern, the basics of the attack. A woman or two women are asleep in a room. One of them wakes up because she feels hands on her body. As soon as she's awake, the intruder shines a light in her eyes and shows her a pistol and says, do what I say, or I'm going to kill you. If you scream, I'll shoot you. It's exactly the same way every time. And so the Mays defense team was trying to demonstrate that these kinds of attacks were ongoing while he was in jail and after he was executed. It just kept happening. So the whole list. One of the things I'm doing in the book is I'm really trying to get into the details of every one of these attacks because some of them don't really match and some of them change their story over time. So Della Wagner, for example, she immediately said when her room was invaded, she said, oh, I know who it is, and she identified the guy, and the guy went on trial, and then later she said, oh, I guess it wasn't him. And then she gets added to the list of night marauder cases because she changed her story to match the pattern. So I don't think Della Wagner counts. The Spessard sisters did wake up to find a man in their room, but this was around the time of, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Pants. He was a famous cat burglar in Knoxville. He was famous because he'd break in, he'd swipe your clothing off the floor, empty the pockets, and leave your pants on the front porch. So the Spessard sisters, they think were about to be robbed. So that is often not part of the pattern either. But most of the ones after that are identical. And in fact, Della Wagner, Ida White, Daisy Ward, and Nettie Pinkham were among the many women who testified at the Mays trial to say, no, this happened to me exactly as it happened to Bertie Lindsay. But in each case, the judge excluded their testimony and the jury never got to hear it. All right, so the attacks keep happening. I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of every attack. All in all, there were 45 home invasions, 8 people shot but survived, 6 people killed, and a number of sexual assaults. So I'm not going to get into the details of every one of them. I do have my blog up still where students and I wrote the accounts of all of these. Mary McGill is kind of a sad one for me because of what happened to her after. So she actually testified at the Maurice Mays trial and described how her sister-in-law, Annie, was asleep and was confronted by a man doing exactly this thing, running his hands on her legs, waking her up, shining a light in her face. Mary McGill was going to be killed 6 months later. And everyone assumes, oh, well, the Night Marauder came back to finish what he had started. But in fact, it was revealed later that her husband shot her. And he tried to... And it's a little wild to read about because they had a woman who rented a room with them, and his own little kids said, no, it's true, Daddy shot Mama. And then ran to his room, took his pants off so it would look like he just jumped out of bed, and he carried her body to the neighbor's house to call the police. But that was revealed. So Mary had been part of this team working for the defense of Maurice Mays to talk about what happened to her and her sister-in-law, and then later her husband just used that as cover for his own murderous intentions. A couple of these victims were very young. Alma Booker was about 13. Joy Thomas was 14. Maddie McCall was 54, so that in terms of ages, that's the only real outlier. Most of them were teens or early 20s. I have this huge spreadsheet with every aspect so I can compare all of the attacks. So, in criminology terms, we say that the Night Marauder is a disorganized criminal. He does not scout out your house for days. Basically, he wanders around, he finds basically these simple little houses. I'll show you in the next slide. He finds a room where a woman or two women are asleep, and he jimmies a window or he cuts a screen door. A lot of his attacks are in the summer, and they don't have AC yet. Most of these homes don't have electricity at all. So leave a door open or a window open for the air, and he takes advantage of that. Disorganized because if he fails in one place, he's going to run 3 blocks away and try again. He'll hit up to 5 homes in a night if he keeps getting turned away. So in this particular map from one of my blog posts, a woman named Maud Maples was confronted. She had been drinking. She and her roommate had been drinking, and so they were a little kind of foggy-eyed. But they said, this guy was in our room, and we told him to get lost, and then our landlord from the next room over shot his weapon into the floor, scaring this man off. Well, a little over an hour later, he attacks a different house just down the street. And in that one, he does happen to... this is where he starts doing the sickest part, I think, of all of this. Up until this point, he's been a serial rapist, willing to threaten and shoot if he needs to get away. The attack on Lula Robinson and her sister-in-law, Elizabeth, was the first in which, instead of running away after shooting someone, he stays. He shot Lula for resisting him, and then while she bled out in the bed, he went to the next bed and he assaulted her sister-in-law. And this is going to be a new feature of some of his attacks. And eventually he's going to start looking for young couples so he can shoot the guy before attacking the wife. So it's really appalling stuff. This is the typical target. Most of these houses are simple 3-room or sometimes 4-room houses. This one happens to be what they call kind of a shotgun house, right? There's no hallway, it's just room after room. And technically the living room or the front room was not a bedroom, but a lot of people were, working class, they're mill workers, and sometimes they'll have 4 or 5 people living in this house, and that means somebody's sleeping right inside the front door. So all he has to do is get in the house and get back out. I had assumed he was picking houses without electricity because it prevented people from flipping the switch on. And in fact, there's at least one case where a young woman went to reach for the matches on her bedside table and he had to knock her hand away. Well, in a later attack, a woman went to find the bedside matches and they'd been gone. Like he was in the room long enough to clear them out, so she couldn't even get matches. And I thought electricity was the main deal here. But when I think about the layout of all these attacks, he knows what the layout's going to be before he even goes in there. He's not going to risk attacking a house with 2 or 3 floors, complicated hallways, in and out. Very simple. This is one triple event where he went into Ruth Cox's house, but her daddy woke up and he ran. And he got to Annie Key's house and her daddy woke up, so he ran. And then he got to a house where Alice Burnett and Eula Henry were sleeping. This case is especially sad too because Alice had been engaged to the son of a widow named R.C. Hamilton. The son had been killed in a rail yard accident. And so Alice continued to visit Mrs. Hamilton because she'd lost all her family. She was a recent widow. She had just lost her son. And so this hypothetical daughter-in-law was her only remaining family. And she happened to visit, stayed for dinner, spent the night, and that's the night somebody broke in. Alice and Eula did a pretty good job. They tag-teamed that guy. They wrestled him. They almost got the gun away. But he managed to whip his arm up just enough to shoot Alice in the side. So she died later, the next day. And Eula Henry would go on to testify in the Mays trial as well. So, attacks are ongoing. Between January and November, there are 13 home invasions, 4 women assaulted, 2 deaths. Ida Tilson, I've been contacted by a couple of descendants of survivors, and so I've actually talked to a great niece of Ida Tilson. Ida Tilson was sleeping in the front room with her 13-year-old sister when she woke up to find a guy trying to climb into bed with them. And she fought him off, and she was resisting, and he said, "Fine, then I'll take your sister." And she's like, "No, you're not." And he ended up shooting Ida and then running away. Now, what he said to the little sister, Georgia, he said, "You tell anyone who I am, and I'm coming back for you." And she, according to her great-grandniece, she never did tell. She identified him. She picked him out of a photo, but she wouldn't tell anybody who he was because she was that scared for the rest of her life. Lester Dooley will be the first male victim and the first married couple that the night marauder attacks. Same kind of deal. In this case, maybe it's more of a challenge, I don't know. But in this case, he challenged Lester first and said, "Get out of bed, I'm getting in bed with your wife." And Lester's like, "No." And so Lester ends up dying. I recently was a guest on a podcast with a team of criminologists, and one of them is a geoprofiler. Now, normally that means he can try to zero in like the neighborhood where the serial killer lives. But what he found is that while there is a cluster, every red pin is a scene of an attack, and some of them are quite far away. So while there's a cluster in one neighborhood, a couple of them are far away. But he realized that if you look at the tram line, the trolley, all of the attacks are within a certain walking distance of the trail line. And so the geoprofiler asked me, he said, "Your main suspect is actually from Blount County. Was there regular service? Could he travel to Knoxville?" I said, "Yeah, he sure could." There was a train. He had part ownership in a car. He frequently stayed at hotels. Yeah, I haven't even gotten to him yet. But yeah, I have a suspect. There was a second suspect, John Honeycutt. Now, this also seems like a real stretch. These attacks keep happening. The police are saying, "Shoot to kill, arm yourselves." There's a curfew. They keep having dragnets. They're determined to catch this person. And so if you're out after curfew, you're automatically suspect. Well, John Honeycutt was trying to sneak out of town with another man's wife. And he was confronted by police for being out after curfew, and he shot towards the police but kept running. And they got out of state, but then he was arrested and brought back. And they said, "We think you're probably the night marauder because you had a gun and you were out after curfew and we're trying to catch this guy." He was convicted only of firing his gun at Captain Schneider, and then he died of mysterious circumstances while in custody. It's really at this point that the crimes start to shift to Blount County. Miss Mary McCampbell, she was the matron at the industrial home. She helped take care of the kids there. She found somebody breaking in, and he hit her in the head with his flashlight and left. She wasn't sure it would really count, but of course it's an industrial home with teenage orphans in it, so she thought it was somebody coming after the resident. V.J. Hultquist, if you may have heard of him, he's considered the godfather of Alcoa. He was a city manager and also the plant manager. It had been 7 months since the last attack in Knoxville, so we're not sure why there was a big lull. But the last attack in Knoxville happened, and then 7 months later it picks up in Blount County. And Hultquist knew what's going on up in Knoxville, and so he buys some bloodhounds. And he's not going to stop there either. When the attacks really pick up in Blount County in 1923, as I said, on July 5th, there were 5 different events in the same night, just running from house to house until trying to find somebody he can target. It gets to be pretty scary. Hultquist is going to actually make use of his connections with the Aluminum Company of America, because In the 1920s, police had very little resources, and a lot of what we can consider forensic science has not been really established yet. So they didn't have a lot to work with. And so they relied on private investigators. Now, there were some famous agencies like the Pinkertons and, strikebreakers, that kind of thing. But most corporations had their own private eyes. And so Hultquist called the Aluminum Company of America in Pittsburgh and said, "Do we have a guy?" They said, "We have a guy." And they sent him down. And he would, the private investigator hired by Hultquist would be working undercover with Sheriff McCampbell in Maryville, Blount County. So the Emery letter. So remember I mentioned they have this whole series of events in Blount County in 1923. Sadly enough, I think anyone who's done historical research knows that this can be all too common. The microfilm version of the Maryville Times and the Maryville Enterprise is missing the months, the editions for when the attacks in Blount County would have happened. So I have no way of knowing how well publicized they were. I mean, people were gossiping, people were talking about it at work, but this anonymous letter, and I have just the end here, this anonymous letter, handwritten in pencil, was sent to Sheriff John McCampbell of Blount County in August 1923, and it details all the attacks that had happened in Blount County. Well, I had fun the other night. I went to this house, and then I went to that house, and then I shot at that guy, and you can't catch me. The criminologists always ask you, well, how much did people know about those attacks? I don't know. Unless somebody has a stash of 1923 Maryville Times in your attic. Anyway, this letter, signed J.J. Emery, claimed responsibility for all the attacks, and he taunted the police, and then he listed all of these names. He said, "I killed Dora Davis, Bertie Lindsay," he didn't know Lula's first name, "Robinson, Mildred Young. I attacked Alice Burnett, Lester Dooley, Daisy Ward," he forgot too, Della Wagner. "I'm responsible for all of these attacks." Well, the sheriff is showing everybody he can this letter. I don't know if that's good police work or not, but he's just walking around town showing this anonymous letter to people. And someone looks at it and says, "Oh, Dora Davis, I know who this is. This is Will Sheffey. Will D. Sheffey." All right. Will Sheffey was from Seymour originally. And he had been dating Dora Davis for much of their teen years, and then she broke up with him. He had a bad reputation. Basically, he was kicked out of Carson and Newman for being too intimate with a classmate. So he had a reputation with women, and her parents said, "We don't want you to see this guy anymore," and he was really mad. But he said they made up, they were friends, and he was happy for her. And then she was shot in 1915. And everybody in town said, "I bet Will killed her. He said he was going to do something. He said he was mad." But he was tried in Sevierville and acquitted. And right after that, he joined up World War I. He shipped out, and so he was gone. When he came back, he found that his mom and brother and sisters had settled in Maryville because it was too uncomfortable staying in Seymour, because half the town thought he was a murderer. So they're like, "We have to go someplace new." So they all moved to Maryville. So he was here by August 1919. He was settled here by the time Bertie Lindsay was attacked. If he is the guilty one and Della Wagner is legitimately part of the series, then it can't possibly be him, because he was on a boat coming home from France. All right. So the two biggest attacks. The first in December 10th, 1923, Luther and Ada Wells were attacked. They both worked in the hosiery mill in downtown Maryville. And this is an amazing thing, because Ada is going to go on and be the chief witness against Will Sheffey in the trials. So they're not well off. They're in one of these little tiny houses. They don't even have a lock on the front door. They have a rocking chair they push up against the door when it's closed. So it's easy to get in. So he breaks in, wakes up Ada by putting his hands on her legs. Same thing as with Lester Dooley. He looks at Luther. He says, "Get out of your bed. I'm getting in bed with your wife." And Luther says, "No way." So they fight. He shoots Luther in the head. He's going to live for like 5 more months after this. And while he's lying on the floor, bleeding, the attacker says to Ada, okay, lay down, do what I tell you. Lie still, don't scream. And she screamed. He says, you scream again, I'm going to shoot you. She screamed again, and he shot her. And she screamed again, and he shot her again. And she screamed at him all the way out the front door and collapsed on the front porch. She was going to survive this. She is going to be the chief witness against him. She's going to pick Will Sheffey, out of a photo lineup. And she never wavers in her identification either. She knows, she says, it's him. I promise you it's him. I know it's him. But he's well-connected. He's a white guy with really respectable connections, half of them to Maryville College, I'm not proud to say. But he's very, very ably defended. I'll get to his defense team in a minute. But Ada was very brave. The Poes were another small family. He was a farmer in Alcoa. He and his wife, Laura, same kind of setup. In this case, they've got a baby on the bed in between them. Laura doesn't want to fight. Clyde really tried his best. Clyde, when confronted by the intruders, said, no, you're not going to be with my wife. And he shot Clyde, and it ended up being in his spine. So with a bullet in his spine, he still dragged himself across the floor to get to his shotgun under the bed while his wife was being assaulted. But the intruder just pulled the shotgun out of his hands and knocked him out. So she weathers the assault, and then as soon as the intruder's gone, she helps Clyde into the bed, and she picks up the baby and runs to the neighbor's house. Clyde only lasts a couple of days, actually. It was an infection. They did the surgery, but they couldn't save his life. And Dr. Walter McMahon in Alcoa, his son has written a memory of him. He said, actually, this was a case that kind of broke his heart. He was ready to retire not long after this. All right, so this is where Hultquist writes to Pittsburgh. So the guy who came to work here, Fred Hendrickson, was head of security at the East St. Louis plant. And he wanted something more challenging. So they said, hey, Alcoa needs a private eye. You want to try your hand? They actually made some really interesting comments. Like I have the correspondence. Judge David Dugan, who also does local history, he let me see some of these papers. Some of these documents I have are from him. And there's correspondence back and forth where somebody in Pittsburgh says, yeah, we're going to send you the right guy too, because you need someone not afraid to put a critter in the ground, is how they put it. Because if this is whether or not it's the same guy who had been attacking in Knoxville, this has to stop. All right, so here's our investigation. Henriksen didn't just pursue Sheffey. That was the one that the sheriff McCampbell thought was the most guilty. But the PI was looking at a couple of other suspects too. But he recorded some really weird stuff. Like the PI was already at work after the attack on the well, so he was here when the attack on the Poes happened. And Will Sheffey stood in the street staring into Sheriff McCampbell's office for 10 full minutes the day that the Poes were attacked later that night. Like this weird stuff. The PI would go back where the Mays defense team had left off, and he would re-interview every single person on that list. So I have his notes as well of every interview. And they got Sheffey indicted on 5 charges: the murder of Clyde Poe, the murder of Luther Wells, the assault of Laura Poe, attempted assault of Ada Wells, and a break-in in the home of Elizabeth Regan. Hers was one of the first homes broken into in Blount County, but nothing came of it. Nobody was hurt. So he was arrested in April of 1925. The first trial, so his defense team was Kramer, Gamble, and Drinnen. And it ended up being a mistrial. So here's our evidence for and against. We have the handwritten anonymous letter that was sent to the sheriff. And there's witness identification, and there are character witnesses. The thing is that if you follow any kind of criminal court, you know that whatever kind of expert the prosecution brings up, defense is going to counter it with their own. So they got one handwriting analysis guy who said, yep, it's the same handwriting. Got some of Will's paperwork from Alcoa, compare it to the letter, said, yep, it's the same handwriting. Well, then the defense has an expert that says, no, it's not. The complicating factors in Ada Wells' memory were that when she was first taken to the hospital, now remember, she'd just seen her husband shot, she's bleeding, she's been shot twice, it's in the middle of the night. She says for the first several hours, I can't describe him. I don't think I can describe him. And then while she's in the hospital the next day recovering from the surgery to remove the bullets, she says, oh my God, he's here. And they're like, what are you talking about? She says, I know what it's like he's standing at the foot of the bed. I can tell you right now. Now, the defense is going to have a field day with that because they're like, she said she couldn't and then she imagined she saw him. Is that what we're going to put people in jail for now? Character witnesses line up on both sides. He's got this bad reputation with women. His coworkers say he doesn't like to socialize. He has all kinds of issues, but other people say no, but he's always been a good guy. He was going to be a school teacher before the Dora Davis trial. So they can't agree, a mistrial declared. There are two other trials. The second trial, December 25th, little interest, ended in another mistrial. The third trial, kind of interest, but this ended in his final acquittal. So he's tried 3 times. The first 2 are mistrials, and then he's acquitted the third time. And keep in mind, Ada's the top witness here. She testified for 8 straight hours in 3 separate trials and never changed her story. I suspect they had a better case to build against him for the Poe attack, but not only did Clyde die, but their little baby died only a couple of months before the first trial, and I think Laura was just not up to it. And so they decided to pursue the Wells case first. In theory, he was supposed to come back for the other charges, but he was never tried again. After the acquittal, he was released. He married Viva Haynes just a couple of days later. Viva was the daughter of a Knoxville farmer. She actually had been one of his character witnesses back in the Dora Davis case. So they'd been seeing each other for decades, but he'd had 3 other marriages in between there, and she was still waiting in the wings. So he gets out of jail, he gets married, and there's one more attack. There were no attacks while he was in jail. This is the case that brought me to this project. Sarah Mason and her daughter, B. Mason Harris, were attacked. Mrs. Mason panicked and tried to jump out the window, and he shot her in her own front yard. And after that, the Sheffys and everyone else just moved on. The number of times I've had people say, wow, I've lived here my whole life. I've been studying in Knoxville my whole life. I never knew there was a serial killer. Everybody just stopped talking about it. Like, he left for California with his wife and most of, a lot of their acquaintances and relatives followed. He was supposed to come back for the remaining charges. He never did. And then nobody else was attacked, and so that was it. Everybody moved on and forgot about it, which is kind of sad. But it's still, some things are still kind of funny to me because, for example, you remember that one of Sheffy's defense lawyers was Russell Kramer. Well, I know Wayne Kramer. He's still connected to Marauder College. And I said to him, he used to come talk to my pre-law students about being a lawyer. And I asked him, do you know anything about the Sheffy case? And he was like, Nancy, the Sheffy case, I've been hearing about it since I was 5 years old. So I do have lots of great sources to work with. So I think we have a little time left. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
When he moved to California, did anybody keep up with him? Did we know what happened to him or if there were similar attacks in the area where he lived?
Well, Well, Hultquist and his private investigator kept an eye. In fact, they alerted LA police that this guy was coming to settle in their area. So they were keeping an eye on him. And at one point, the PI wrote to Hultquist that, yes, it looks like it's happened again, 1931. The problem is Maryville versus LA, right? And he kept moving. If you look at, through Ancestry, you can trace the Sheffy's family. He moved jobs and homes twice a year. So he never stayed in one place for very
Did he
long.
stay married to the same person?
Yeah, he stayed with Viva their whole lives together. He'd had a son from a previous marriage, and he had a son with Viva, and neither of those young men ever married. And so it looks like he has no direct descendants. But yeah, it's hard. I've looked at the newspapers for LA at the time, and I can't even keep track. Yes, sir.
So when they changed from Knoxville to Maryville, did anything else happen in Knoxville during
No.
that period?
Not that I can find. I mean, there are still break-ins, of course, but nothing that matched that exact pattern. And I'm not sure why he would have taken a break for 7 months. He did have a marriage, one of his marriages during that time period. She had left him to go to Florida. Her name was Ruby McNutt. And she had left him to go to Florida just to get away from him. And she refused to come back to testify in the trial of her former husband because she said she was so afraid of him. And so there's some suspicion that he just brought the violence home for a while, and then when she left, he started going back out again. But there's a lot of speculation because we don't have a lot of evidence. And, it's 100 years ago. Things are gone. Yes.
Will your book be published? 30%?
Well, I'd say I'm about 75% done writing it now. I've had agents tell me that you can usually shop around true crime before it's done, before you're really done, because the ending is not going to change. So I'm not going to change my mind about what the book's about. But I want to feel like I have more of it done before I bring it to an agent. And I've learned so much. These crime writers conferences have been so much fun, in part because it's so different from academic publishing. And so it's just a whole different approach. So I have to figure out how to get an agent and basically how to shop it around.
I might have missed it, but did you ever say what age he was during this time?
He would have been, I think he was 18 when he was charged with the murder of Dora Davis. I think he would have been in his 30s when he was active in East Tennessee. Yes.
So did you, after you left Los Angeles, did you follow up, did you stay in California? Did you follow up on any of the towns?
Well, he stayed in California, but he moved around the LA area. So, huge urban area, and he kept moving to usually small houses. And Viva stood by him the whole time, I've had students tell me that there are, I can't remember which famous serial killer it was now, but when he got married, he actually settled down and stopped murdering. And so it's possible that Viva changed him. I don't know. But they seemed happy, and they stayed together for the rest of their lives. Yes.
I've got a question about how the victims are represented, and do you find that they are, like in the newspaper coverage, are they represented quite similarly, or is there differences in terms of, what people knew about them as individuals? Because often victims are blamed for crimes that happen to them.
There was, I wasn't surprised to find that right after the attack on Bertie Lindsay, there were immediately folks who said, well, what kind of house is she running if guy thinks he can just walk in the middle of the night? So there was a little bit of that, but more often than not, look, Southern honor culture was full swing at this point. They tend to talk about the women as, they're all these delicate flowers willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save their purity, that kind of thing. I think when Alice Burnett was shot, she and Eula Henry were the ones who almost took him down. People wrote about her being willing to give up her life so she wouldn't lose something more precious. That's really how they talked about it. And when the men spoke about it, they tended to only refer to things as indecent proposals or outrageous acts. Whereas sometimes the women were quite plain spoken. I read the interview with Laura Poe where she described the assault to the investigator. And in a room full of men, some of whom she had never even met, she gave them the play-by-play. And I think that more often than not, the women were portrayed as very sympathetic, especially since so many of them were young. So yeah, we should have been protecting them, that kind of thing.
So how many people were killed altogether?
I think I need to update my notes. I think there were 8 people killed altogether, and another 6 or 7 that were, I think maybe 8 that were assaulted, and several more that were shot, at least wounded. One of the cases I was working on just yesterday involved a young woman who was sleeping with her baby, and he did shoot her, and she survived. But at first she was scared because she was holding the baby, and she thought that the bullet had gone through the baby and into her, but it didn't. It's just the loud noise frightened the baby, and so she ended up being okay. I mean, besides being shot, but yes.
I think I missed this, but did you say while he was away in World War I, there were no attacks?
There were no attacks. This all started after he came back. But after a lot of people came back, right? It was 1919, so.
He was in the service during World War I. Did he have a good record or?
No, he didn't, because he arrived. He was going to work with the sanitation corps. He didn't arrive in France until after the armistice had already been signed. So he basically was there long enough to help pack up and go back. So, yeah, and this happens too. Sometimes the press, there were members of the press who wanted to sugarcoat Will Sheffey, and they talked about his heroism in the war. And even Sheffey was like, I didn't see a day of action. I don't know what you're talking about.
At least he was honest with it.
Yeah. Yes.
So I've got a question, it's a bit half-baked, so bear with me. And it's about like how this fits into sort of broader representations of violence against women in this period, broader patterns of actual violence, and how, where does this fit into a larger sort of imagination about crime, and in particular murder, because like the serial killer is something that's a construct of the modern period, in
Sure.
my opinion. So where would this fit in within that kind of broader, is it similar, is it different, is it specific to that post-war period, or is it something that fits into a sort of larger?
I think it's very much tied to the post-World War I era in the South. I think that in urban areas in the North, you would tend to see more likely, like, what was she doing out at night? What kind of reputation did she have? Whereas here, I think there was a tendency, at least for white women, that we'll assume that they were
Victims.
Yes.
Fewer victims.
Yes, yeah.
And I suppose class doesn't play that much of a thing there because these tended to be lower class.
They all tended to be mill workers, telephone operators. Lots of people worked in the mills. And one of the criminologists in this podcast I was invited to last March, he said, is there any way, can you tell me, could this have been somebody who had worked at scheduling? How does he know which women's husbands would be working the night shift? How does he know which houses are going to be empty? And the thing is, they're all over the place. The Brookside Mill, the Marble Mill, there's no two that are the same. And the railway and all of that stuff. But the tram line was significant because I think if you're a regular rider, you might get a sense for who's getting on every night. And one of the other things I didn't mention when I talked about Georgia Tilson, she was the 13-year-old whose sister Ida was shot next to her. She told reporters at the time that she knew him, that it was a white guy who did not live in Knoxville who visited frequently. And someone else that same night said, oh gosh, I saw that guy too. He was booking it across the field trying to get to the train station before the train left. And they knew him as someone who was not local but who visited a lot. Yes.
Were all the victims white?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, so then, how much of an effect did the detective from Pittsburgh that came have on finding who it was?
I'm sorry, can you
Well,
repeat?
You said the Pittsburgh Alcoa Company sent a guy from where Pittsburgh, right? And how much effect did he actually have in the investigation?
I think he had a lot of impact. Now, Alcoa publicly stated that they would never fund a private investigator, but of course they did. I mean, I have the receipts, like literally receipts. He's the one who compiled the list and re-interviewed everyone going back to Della Wagner from before Birdie Lindsay. He conducted surveillance. He had an alias. He was Ed Jones running a paint shop. And he would get in on the gossip. And so he was instrumental in getting Sheriff McCampbell to pursue Will Sheffey. He basically said, yeah, your suspect, that's the guy. I really feel it, that's the guy. Now, this is going to end up hurting the prosecution's case against Will Sheffey because, for whatever reason, the PI, when he came, worked closely with John McCampbell, but McCampbell had just been voted out of office, and his replacement, Walter Pate, had a different suspect in mind. And so the defense team just has to say, well, okay, yeah, you have this PI here working undercover, gathering intel. Why isn't he working with the actual sheriff? Why is he working with the former sheriff? That doesn't make any sense. And so that ends up hurting the prosecution's case quite a bit. And, you know, I think I can't say Will Sheffey was the one who was doing it. He was acquitted. There was not enough evidence to convict him. So I'm trying to be very careful about that. But there were enough people who were persuaded that he was the one. And in fact, this group picture that people were picking Sheffey out of, like, you know, here's a range of pictures. Is any of the guys in this? They didn't do lineups yet. It was too early for that. So they would show a group picture or a couple of group pictures, and the suspect would be in one of them. And if the witness can pick him out, say, yeah, that's him, that's as good as a lineup at the time. Georgia Tilden picked out Will Sheffey. Laura Poe picked out Will Sheffey. Ada Wells picked out Will Sheffey. So there were a lot of women who were like, no, we're sure. And, but the jury was never convinced.
So would that have, because the attacks were done at night, people were in bed, no electricity, darkness, probably had an effect on them actually seeing who it was?
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons why, even going back to the Maurice Mays trial, the survivor, Ora Smith, she testified that he kept a flashlight in her eyes the whole time. She couldn't see him. And that was part of the pattern, was you wake somebody up and then you shine the light right in their eyes. And the one woman who claims to have gotten a really good look was Elizabeth Regan. She picked Will Sheffey out of the picture. But she happened to be in the room next to the room where a couple was being confronted by a man with a pistol. But he was shining his flashlight into their faces, and they had a white wall that reflected back on him. So she's peeking through the doorway from the other room, and she's like, I actually got a look at him. I could see from the reflected light. She might have been the only person who got a good look at him. There's one case I didn't even include up here because nothing really happened, but it was one of the multiple. He actually walked into a house where a woman was standing in the kitchen going to prepare firewood. And so she's standing in her kitchen with an actual hatchet. And like, you got to think, all right, maybe you need to back off this one. He still tried to fight it out of her hand, and she whacked him a couple of times, and he took off. But so yeah, he's just bumbling about half the time. And the houses are more isolated when he gets to Blount County. He tends to hit places that don't have such close neighbors as they did up here in Knoxville. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the trolleys. Did they run? Did the trolleys run 24 hours?
That I don't know yet. I'm going to have to find some sources. Yeah, that was something the criminologist asked as well, because, well, the attack on Joy Thomas, she was one of the teenagers. The bloodhounds made it as far as the trailway. So I don't know, enough people worked on the night shift that I wouldn't be surprised if there were late night runs, but I don't know the hours. I need to find that. Yes.
Psychological profile on Sheffy?
As much as can be done from this point,
Or I guess you're on the attacks. I mean, what kind of person would have committed those acts? Would he have fit that profile?
let's see. One of the criminologists said there's a particular kind of profile, the kind of, not just disorganized, but the kind of person who like wants to feel macho. Like he's going to find somebody vulnerable and make them do as he says, and hurt them if they don't. His instructions to Laura Poe were very specific. I want you to take a blanket and put it on the ground, so forth, like step by step. So I don't remember the name of what that kind of profile is, but it makes sense that he's someone who's he like gets an urge, finds somebody he can take advantage of, and then if that doesn't work, goes to the next street over until he finds somebody he can dominate. So yeah, there is a sense there. I've had students who have been trying to work on things like that, but it's hard. We don't have much to go on from that long ago. Yes.
I'm having a hard time believing not one of these juries. I mean, back then were jurors all men or mixtures?
Yes. Yeah, they're all men. They're all men, and in fact, the first two mistrials were close. Like the juries were like evenly split. So there was like half the jury was convinced he was guilty in 2 trials, and they still couldn't persuade the rest. Well, I thank you all for coming, giving up your lunchtime.